Welcome to the second episode of Earth Inhabited. In this episode, I'm speaking with Emma Richards, a wildlife criminologist who spent years working at the intersection of conservation, security, and policing. We talk about poacher decision making, intelligence led policing, and how to best use the technology we have available to us today. This conversation challenges how we think about conservation enforcement. Thank you, Emma, for joining us. What got you into conservation in the first place?
I've always been interested in wildlife. I was brought up from a very early age, initially in Zambia and Botswana. So I kind of got the bug then. So I went to university to do zoology first, and then got a little bit distracted by the army. Didn't quite manage to finish my degree. So I finished it later while I was in the army through the Open University. At that point, I then got so I've had quite a sort of, scattershot career. While I was in the army, I got very interested in humanitarian work. So I did a master's in development management, again through the Open University. Um, and then when I left the army, I ended up in a mining company working as a security manager, which was absolutely fascinating. Just so much going on. A colleague used to say that, it's like drinking water from a fire hose. Um, or that you have to drain the swamp, but you're too busy fighting alligators to be able to have time to drain the swamp. So it was very chaotic, and trying to sort of impose some order on that chaos was a big challenge and a really big experience. But yeah, from there, I then moved into trying to work in corporate security, which was very interesting because the corporate security kind of in the UK or say Singapore, they have very big job titles, but actually the jobs themselves felt quite small. Whereas working in Mauritania on the gold mine, the job title was pretty simple, but the job was huge. And so that mismatch didn't really fulfill kind of my work style. Or it just felt quite boring, basically. And so I started looking at getting back to my first love, zoology, and I found a job working in wildlife crime for the Wildlife Conservation Society in Congo. And after a couple of years of doing that, and I was drawing on my security skills and the skills that I'd picked up in the army, and also then started trying to learn more about policing. So I got very interested in policing theory and criminology, started listening to podcasts, and then ended up having a conversation with somebody at Portsmouth University who suggested doing the professional doctorate. So I started, and honestly, I think it's the best thing I've ever done. So yeah, that's how it dovetails, because all of the elements draw in nicely together, and they've sort of all led to where I am right now. So I was working on the information collection side and trying to develop the analytical capability of the unit that I was working with. And I was seeing that the analysis that we were doing wasn't making its way to operations. So it wasn't being responded to from an operational point of view. So I was looking for general policing resources, and I came across Reducing Crime by Jerry Ratcliffe, Professor, I think Jerry Ratcliffe now, who is working. He's former British police, but he moved into academia. The podcast is fantastic. Learned a hell of a lot, and there's a lot of online resources. And I started looking at intelligence-led policing, which was something that he sort of was part of a team of people, sort of progression, and he developed it to a large extent. I think other people were involved, but he's kind of the main name. And just sort of started seeing things about crime theory that I felt had parallels with wildlife crime that we weren't applying. So things like, offenders, or crime concentration. So crime being concentrated in a few locations, and 5% of locations, for example, being responsible for 50% of crimes, or hotspot policing, where if you police a hotspot for, I think it's about 15 or 20 minutes a day, you get a 20% reduction in crime overall, and then a reduction of crime not only in that area but also within a radius. So you get a diffusion of benefits. And so seeing those sorts of ideas and pulling on kind of military theory. So I was harking back to Frank Kitson, low intensity operations, and reading some of the books that I'd read while I was in the army, and those sorts of them, bringing that into it as well. And just seeing areas where, there was a really great baseline that had already been developed, and because that baseline was already there was then opportunity that could be seized. But yet I think people weren't aware that the opportunity was there to be seized. And so I was seeing a gap in the market effectively.
Why do you think so many anti poaching efforts struggle to achieve a lasting impact?
I don't know, it's almost about building a strategy that from the ground up. Because you've got to have those low level concerns in consideration. You can't just say we're going to stop poaching, because you need to be thinking about all of the various elements that go into making sure that stopping poaching happens. From, have you got the resources to put the guys on the ground? Have you got enough fuel for the vehicles? Are the tyres on the vehicles in suitable repair so that you're not going to get a blowout while you're on the route and have a car accident in the middle of the forest where you've got no resources for evacuation? What's the medical care for your rangers? How long are they going to be in the field? What's appropriate for them? Like, what's an appropriate length of time? How much do they have to carry? How far are they going to walk? What kind of tactics are we using? So that, if you've got somebody who's weighed down by 85 kilograms or more, and you're expecting them to be chasing after poachers who carry, actually, to be fair, very little, are those tactics meshing with what you're asking them to try and achieve? And so it's sort of the work that I'm trying to do now is develop those systems, so that we've got the proper education behind us. We're doing things that are backed up by something that is scientifically supported. So, coming back into the crime science, a key thing is deterrence. And deterrence in crime theory is underpinned by certainty, celerity, and severity. Certainty is the certainty of capture. Celerity is the how quickly the case is processed and somebody is put into prison. And severity is the severity of the penalty. What we seem to be focusing on is certainty of prosecution. So if you get caught, then you're definitely going to be prosecuted and you're going to have a harsh penalty. But what we're not really looking at is certainty of capture. And that's what the criminological literature is saying is key to deterrence, is the more likely you are to be caught, the less likely you are to do the thing. And so you're talking about cost benefit analyses. And so from what I've seen so far, the certainty of capture in the first place, or certainty of detection, could be higher. And in some cases, I've done some analyses of hotspots and then looked at the level of patrolling in the same year. And while it looks as though there's been good coverage of the area throughout the year, when you actually focus down on the hotspots, that came out as, on average, a hotspot was being accessed once every 38 days or so. And if you consider that a poaching cycle of an offender might be, so that we were looking at snaring, I was looking at snaring hotspots. If the snaring activity cycle is anywhere from 3 to 10 days, but your patrol cycle is nearly 40 days long, they've got between 4 and 10 opportunities to get in and out without any likelihood of detection. It's a little bit of a difficult one, because a lot of the time you are also patrolling for all sorts of crimes as well. You're not just patrolling for snaring, you are patrolling for crime in general. And so that's one of the other things that I want to look into is, okay, can we actually refine our aims, and then can we make our missions more specific so that we can actually focus on the problem? Because if you decide, okay, snaring is our key problem, right, let's focus all our resources to that. Let's get it to a manageable level. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of it completely, but let's see what works in terms of reducing it to something that we can live with. And then maybe we can start focusing on the next biggest problem. Or if you're lucky enough to have the resources, maybe you have one team for one sort of crime type, another team for a different type of crime type. And so you're applying the strategies that work for those crime types. You're not trying to be all things to all people everywhere, all the time, all at once. Which I think is partly what's happening because everybody is so under resourced. There's not enough people. The expanse of space that most people are dealing with is enormous. You can never be everywhere all at once. And so it just seems sensible to me that, okay, we've got to a certain level. Now let's start trying to focus on our biggest issues and let's really work on those because you don't have to be everywhere. Not everywhere is good for snaring. I was working in one place and they were looking at snaring around water holes, and actually the snares weren't being put on the water holes; they were being put in the sort of transition zone vegetation from because all of the trees had been stripped out at the water holes, so there was nothing to pin a snare to until you get to where the vegetation's growing again. And so then that's where the snare lines were being put. Now, once you've realised that, you don't have to waste your time patrolling through the middle of the forest that's much further away, potentially. Don't know yet. But you could actually just focus on that area that you know is a high risk zone. Um, and from what I've been seeing with the spatial analyses I've been doing with QGIS, a lot of these locations are sort of repeatedly victimized, which is something you also see in urban crime, is repeat victimization. So studies on burglary have looked at if a house has been burgled, it is likely it has a higher risk going forward because it becomes a target. And so you do get repeat victimization of either the same property or properties in that street, those sorts of things. So understanding that and knowing about that theory and how it applies to urban crime, you can then say, okay, well, how do we apply this to wildlife crime? Does it fit? Does it actually work? Because sometimes it may not work, and it may not be appropriate to the situation or the context. But if it fits, it potentially gives us a starting point for how do we deal with the issue.
Where does the opportunity for poaching actually emerge? And is there a theory to explain that?
It's crime pattern theory, and the idea that you have sort of nodes, edges, and pathways, and essentially crime happens in an offender's awareness space, which is the area that they are accustomed to living and moving in, and uh, so crime happens if there is an opportunity within the offender's awareness space. Um, so sort of if you take yourself for example or me for example, you will have your home, you'll have a place that you go to work, you'll have a particular place that you like to socialize, and a few places around your immediate vicinity that you know pretty well. And I think for most people, I'm not sure if I'm right on this, but I think it's around 2 miles or so. Obviously it depends on where you live, but most people have kind of like a radius of an area that they live in that they know very, very well. I used to live on the edge of Islington when I worked in London, and there were, that immediate vicinity and my route to work, I knew very, very well. And then get a few streets out of my comfort zone, and I wasn't quite so sure. And so it's the same idea for offenders that they have these same sorts of awareness, and that they will commit crimes where there are opportunities within that awareness zone. And it's really interesting because in burglary, people have looked at it quite a lot, and sort of if somebody's younger, they tend to stay within their comfort space. As somebody gets a bit older and a bit more confident in their abilities, they might go out of their awareness space, and do more of a marauding sort of style. And then they age out of crime. So it's quite interesting about how those dynamics work. And I'm quite interested in terms of how does that translate to um, poaching, because obviously on a day-to-day basis most people are not going into the middle of the national park to go to work or whatever. Most of them are working in their local fields, and they're going to the bar in the village to socialize with friends, so everything's all very quite close together. So I'm interested in how do people learn, um, and a lot of it is, yeah, my father taught me or my uncle taught me, or I learned at an early age. But some of it is, oh well, I saw an opportunity, I know the guys in the village who go, I was running short of money and I asked if I could go with them. um, and then people start at a very low level. Sometimes they have to buy in, so they sort of provide or supplement, or what's the word, sorry, losing the word. But they buy shares almost, so they have to pay a kind of fee to join, to pay for the resources to go. So like the mealie meal that they take with them, or the cooking oil, or the what sort of weapons or whatever, and they get a cut of the meat that they can then sell or consume themselves, and so they make a little bit of money that way. Um, but it's sort of, how does that opportunity come about? Because if you're trying to stop the opportunity of where is the animal killed, that's actually a lot more difficult, because it's in the middle of a really remote area that might be quite difficult to get to. Whereas the opportunity that is further back, that occurs in the village, that maybe you can stop differently, might be the easier one to focus on. So that's why I'm interested in, how is opportunity created for people, and the opportunity is not necessarily at the point of crime. I mean, that is somebody coming into contact with an animal. That's the opportunity, but also the opportunity of, how did it happen in the first place? How did you get from sitting in your village, um, worrying about your bills, to picking up a bicycle and some mealie meal and going off with a bunch of other people to go hunting in an area that maybe you're not terribly familiar with?
How do you combine crime pattern theory and hotspotting into a single operational approach?
You have enough information to know who your committed offenders are, or your most prolific offenders. You know roughly what their activity cycle is. Um, if you know where your crime hotspots are, and you know roughly what their awareness zone is, you can then start using things like QGIS to do least cost pathway mapping, and put people in the right place at the right time. So that's the grand theory, is that you pull all of these together, you have an overall intelligence picture or information picture, um, and you develop your strategy on that basis. Whereas what a lot of people understand intelligence led to be is actually something I would call more informant pushed, or reacting to informant information. So you might get somebody saying, hey, I know that this guy is going hunting in 3 days and he's going over here. And then you send a patrol in response to that. That's not intelligence led, but that's what most people think is intelligence led. Or you'll have a case where you think that somebody is engaged in a network, you will engage an informer to offer to buy something, and then that person gets arrested when they bring the thing for sale. And that's also considered to be intelligence led, but it's not actually. It's informant pushed. Intelligence led is pulling in all of those various strands, looking at what your trends and your patterns are, and then developing your strategy on that basis. So if your overall trend is, we've got a lot of small scale bushmeat poaching, okay, our strategy is going to be to reduce that small scale bushmeat poaching by X percentage, by doing sort of intensive targeted patrolling in the hotspot areas, for example. That would be an intelligence led strategy.
Is hotspotting basically an 80-20 approach to wildlife crime?
Yeah. So there is a book called, I probably should have looked up the reference. I can never get the title fully right. but it's 55 steps for wildlife crime problem solvers, I think, if I've got it correct. And that was written by several people who have done an incredible job of explaining this and explaining how you would get to a baseline, and also explaining the kind of 80-20 principle. But if a small proportion of um, actors are causing the majority of your crime, then if you focus on dealing with that, maybe you put 80% of your resources towards dealing with that, then you can significantly reduce crime just by focusing on that smaller element. So that's where I'm coming from with the idea of calculating hotspots. And I'm using a crime science developed process. A lot of people use heat maps or kernel density estimates, and I'm trying to use Gettysord GI starred, which I haven't seen used massively in wildlife crime conservation. I think a few people may have done. So I don't want to do anybody a disservice. My memory is shocking, so I read papers and I make a note, and then I forget names. So yeah, hopefully nobody's going to be thinking, "Oh God, I've done this, and why doesn't she know about it?" But yeah, so that idea is about using something that has got sort of a statistical probability behind the idea of is it a hotspot or not, based on our observations, and to use that based on catch per unit effort. So that's sort of trying to remove patrol bias. So rather than if you've got area A and you go to area A 70% of your time, and you've got area B and you go there 30% of the time, but you're still finding the same amount of snares, or maybe you find more snares in area A, um, by doing the calculation for catch per unit effort, it it equalizes, or it sort of levels out the amount of time you've been there and adjusts for that, so that you're not saying that area A is a hotspot. Actually, area B might have relatively more snares. You just haven't been there as much, so you're not seeing it. And so that would flag up as a hotspot because it's got relatively more activity based on the amount of patrolling you've done. Sorry, I'm not a mathematician, so my explanation is very, very poor. But it's really about just trying to remove that patrol bias, so that you're not sort of going, oh well, fixed on this area because we always find things there, but actually you're only finding things there because you're always going there, and then maybe somewhere else that you're discounting because you haven't been there as much. So really, it's sort of just trying to take that into account before you do your hotspot calculations, so that you can then say, okay, well, here's a suspicion. And so what I've been saying is that if you have a hotspot, it's a suspicion that you refute or confirm. So and this is going back to security management, where you're not profiling a person or anything like that. You are saying, okay, we have a suspicion based on these indicators that this activity is happening more in this area. So we're going to patrol in such a way as to confirm or refute that suspicion, and then we can respond accordingly. So yeah. Sorry, the name of the thing is predictive profiling, and it's just a little bit. So when I was doing the course on it, the comment was, it can sometimes be confused with profiling of people, but it's not profiling of people. It's profiling an incident based on indicators of activity. So yeah.
What have you learned from offender interviews that challenges current conservation approaches?
The research I did for my doctorate was interviewing people who were in prison for various wildlife offences. And I was very, very lucky to get some organisational support, because 32 facilities were visited by a number of teams. I couldn't have done all of that work on my own. So I didn't get to do the interviews myself, which I would have loved to have done, but I don't think it would have worked very well because there were all sorts of language difficulties and logistics and all of that sort of thing. Um, but we got some really, really good material, and I think probably better material than we would have got if I'd done the interviews myself. But it's a huge wealth of data, and I was initially looking for, I was very interested in, it's called risk terrain modeling. And it's looking at the features of the built environment that indicate whether a place is likely to be at risk of crime. Um, so, it's your usual places where you've got bad street lighting, or you've got sort of like your known druggy hangouts, that kind of thing, or a particular bar that empties out over, like, after hours, those sorts of things. Where the rough places are going to be, and those generate so this is coming back to crime concentration. Those places generate most of the crime. And so I was interested in seeing if we could find out what those places might be for wildlife crime. So this is where I'm going back to the waterhole and the trees further back. Is the soil stable enough to put a snare out? Are the trees thick enough to be able to hold the weight of an animal that's panicking, attached to a snare wire? There are certain things that you will need for a place to be a good place for snaring to happen. And so snaring will happen there, it won't happen in other areas. So I was interviewing or asking questions on that basis to try and find out what those environmental features were, to sort of see if we can, and this is something I still want to do, because I have got that data and I want to apply the risk terrain modeling to test it in this environment. But incidentally to that, some of the case histories that people were telling, and it was about 18% of them, there was an indication that they might not have thought about doing the crime if the opportunity hadn't been presented. And these are self-reported, so there's no verification. So I can't say, yes, this is definitely the case. All I can say is that more research needs to be done. But if the indication that these crimes are being prompted by state actors, so paid informants, for example, or law enforcement officers themselves working undercover, and it's somebody who wouldn't have thought of doing the crime anyway, but that there's quite a high predisposition for those sorts of crimes because wildlife crime is not taken very seriously. And if you consider that the rate of complaints in other areas, or the threshold is about 10%, before you start thinking that you've got an issue, we might have an issue here where we're potentially creating the crime to a certain extent. Um, so I don't want to be alarmist about it. I'm not saying that these figures are definite by any extent. I'm just saying that there is an indication that this may be the case, and if that is so, it warrants further indicate. Sorry, there are indications that this may be the case, and I think it warrants further investigation, because the consequences of not investigating it further could mean that people are unnecessarily being imprisoned, crime is unnecessarily being generated, we're losing opportunities for collection of information to get us into the people who really are committing the significant amounts of crime, and potentially we're not being as effective as we could be. And so that's what I'm trying to do with some of the data driven information, is using that patrol data to look at those on the ground elements that potentially takes us away from the low hanging fruit effectively. And I think this is something that's seen in policing world round, is that if you have an incentive structure that asks you to measure your performance on the basis of how many people you arrest, then you get the issue of lots of people being arrested. And I've seen a few videos recently come up on the cobra bounty in India back in the 1950s, or sort of under colonial rule anyway. But a bounty was put on cobras as a pest. And so people were paying for per head of cobra, and some very enterprising people started breeding cobras. And so then you ended up with a cobra boom rather than getting rid of the cobras, which was the original intention. And so, and I, and you see that in other cases where you sort of provide an incentive that you think is going to do the job, but it actually creates a boom in the thing that you wanted to stop. So it's taking that good intention. It's going, hey, look, we might have an unintended consequence here. I think we need to investigate it better just to make sure. I'm not saying it is, but if it is, that would be bad. And we could be doing better. So let's make sure that we're not doing it that way that causes that unintended consequence, because that also has knock-on implications for not just creating the crime and potentially killing species that we're supposed to be protecting, putting people in prison where they don't necessarily need to be in prison, which then has its own whole bunch of social implications. But also, it reduces trust in law enforcement. And so if you have people saying, oh, well, you care, and this is a common story that people have heard in wildlife crime law enforcement, you care more about the animals than us, we're suffering. If an elephant's attacking me and I kill the elephant, why are you more concerned with the fact that I've now got a dead child, maybe, or no crops and no food for the rest of the year? And so that can create resentment, and then that loses you support for your conservation efforts. And so I kind of see it as this whole system where all the moving parts need to work together. And there's somebody who says it very well. I can't remember if he's again professor or doctor, Ian Games, and the quote is that conservation is not rocket science. Rocket science is easy. Because rocket science obeys the laws of physics and mathematics, and it's predictable and it reacts in the same way every time. Conservation, everything's different, everything changes. What works somewhere might not work somewhere else. It's all context dependent. It depends on the people, it depends on the situation, it depends on the weather, all sorts of factors. So you can't have that level of predictability because it's a wicked problem. So yeah, just trying to kind of apply some criminological theory to some of these ideas to try and help it become a little bit more, not predictable exactly, but manageable. And that was something that I found in security management, where I would set up a rule and people would say, oh, well, what about this exception that might happen? Or what about this random thing that might happen? And I'd be sat there going, well, I can't prepare for every eventuality. So what I'm going to do is prepare something that fits most eventualities, and then we'll deal with the exceptions as they happen. And that provided a lot more stability and predictability for people, which they seem to appreciate, because then it meant that they then weren't getting messed around unnecessarily and their lives were easier. And then because their lives were easier, it was easier for them to follow the security instructions, so that anybody who wasn't following the security instructions then became somebody of interest, that we were, okay, well, why aren't you following the security instructions? Is it because you're up to badness, or is it because you're not understanding, or we need to adjust the rules, or we haven't factored something in? Let's see what's going on here. But it made those things a lot easier to spot, because everybody else was like, yep, this is easy for me to do. It's much easier for me to follow the rules, and it's much easier for me to sort of behave in a way that is orderly and suitable. So, I mean, we had examples of people taking, I once saw on camera, two guys carrying, a big sort of 40 or 50 litre rucksack. And it was full, and it was taking these two guys to carry it. And the security guards who were watching the cameras were like, yeah, that's fine. And I'm like, hold on, they're leaving camp to go on their off days. Why are they taking so much stuff with them? They should be going with basically an empty bag, because you come into camp with all your goodies and your treats that you want to see you through your rotation. And then you leave with an empty bag to go back because you've used it all. So why is it taking two people to carry this bag? And it was because the coffee and the milk and the tea and the jam and the various items from the cookhouse were being essentially treated as a larder for the rest of the home population. I'm kind of going, okay, no, I do understand, but you are being paid a very good wage for being here compared to the rest of the country. And this is a gold mine, not a charity. So we can't necessarily afford to be supporting you and your wider extended family, while I do have sympathy for the situation that you're in. So let's just keep it to a manageable level, like take a few apples for the journey home. Don't sew 20 into the sleeve of your coat, for example, those kinds of things. And so that was, yeah, just a really good grounding in, if you set the parameters and you make the parameters very easy for most people to follow, then most people will follow them. And then that means that you can concentrate your efforts on your problem children that you really need to focus on, because they will be causing a lot more of an issue than the majority of the population.
When we spoke before, you mentioned the red rope idea. Can you explain how that applies to wildlife crime?
It was from a book I read while I was in mining, and it's by a guy called Dan Ariely, and it's called "Everybody Lies All the Time and What to Do About It," and it's a really interesting book. It's very fun, and if I have this correctly, it was a while ago that I read it, but effectively the idea is that if you go to a museum or a art gallery or somewhere, there's red rope either side that people walk along a defined channel, with the goalposts. Most people don't step over that red rope because it would be too much effort and it would be too obvious and nobody else is doing it. Um, so because the majority of people obey that, it makes it more obvious for somebody who is not going to obey that. If they do it, it's easier to spot them. And so it's that idea of, okay, well, what's our red rope? How do we find that thing that keeps most people sort of walking through the channels, because not to do so is too much effort and they're too likely to get caught, versus how do we spot the guys who are. So that's why I think that you can't just say, oh, bushmeat, or send your rangers out to stop poaching, which sometimes can be the mission, because it's too broad. It needs to be more specific. And again, so I think it's lead ranger. They do actually, I know it's lead ranger that because I've done the course. They do a really, really excellent course that goes through these steps and works people through situational crime prevention, which is basically the setting up the red ropes, so that the majority of people stay within the law. And then that, once you've put those in place, it makes it a lot easier to identify anybody outside of that. But what the key thing that I have just forgotten um, is that, yeah, defining the problem. So rather than having this very broad problem, what they do is they break it down into very specific and measurable issues. So it's not just snaring, it's snaring in this particular location by these particular people at this time of year for this particular purpose. And then you work on that. And then that makes it something that you can measure before, you can do your intervention, you can measure after. And so this is part of the 55 steps for wildlife crime problem solvers, but also the lead ranger course on this. Is excellent in terms of taking you through that series of steps, to teach you how to really define and drill down into those problems so that you can do this proper situational crime prevention, which may not necessarily result in law enforcement activity. It could actually be something completely different. So a really good example of that is, I don't know if I mentioned this, Saving Spots, by Panthera. So they've done this incredible project where leopard skin is quite highly valued and used in the Shembe Church in South Africa, but also in a number of different ceremonies in Zambia. And one is the Kuamboka ceremony, where it's like a barge, and it's to celebrate the end of the rainy season, I think. And the paddlers on the barge all wear leopard skins. And so this is correlation, not causation. But in the years before the project was put in place, up to about 50 skins were being seized per year. And Panthera, with the support of the Royal Barotse establishment, I think Royal Barotse establishment actually approached Panthera to say, hey, can we do this? They established heritage furs, which are essentially very good quality fake fur, to replace the real leopard fur. And then it was decreed that only the heritage furs would be used. And so they have now sort of pretty much wholesale replaced the use of real leopard fur. And in the year after the project was put in place, I think 8 skins were captured or recovered by policing, if I remember correctly. And I need to find my sources on that. But the point is that it wasn't law enforcement that achieved that. It was a replacement product. It was royal decree, and it was educating people about the implications of not taking up the new product, because it would have had a heritage harm if you're not able to sort of access leopard skins. It's basically destroying your culture and a heritage item or heritage activity. But actually, you can still keep doing it with these fake furs, and you can still save your heritage, and respect it and celebrate it. Um, but we're just not using the leopard skin, because if we keep using the leopard skin, then it might be something that dies out because that won't be available in the end.
Are there ways to intervene before a crime happens rather than after?
I was told a story about a patrol team, who had seen a gentleman in the area, in the vicinity of the national park. So, not actually in the park, but in some of the protected areas, managed areas around the national park. And they hadn't spoken to him, and they just left him alone because he wasn't doing anything wrong. And the next day they found him again, and this time he had a dead impala or duiker or something. And so he was arrested, caught red-handed, goes to prison for 6 months. And then there's a social impact because of that, because he's now not looking after his family for 6 months. So what alternatives do they have? um, and I was just thinking about the human wildlife conflict issue, and just thinking. So another thing that Panthera did, if you look at their Kafui report, they established intensive protection zones around sort of key species and key areas for those species. And I was thinking along the ideas of, okay, well, if we know where our main problems are coming from, what if we flip that inside out? And rather than intensively police the vulnerable zones for the cats, why don't we flip it around and police the intensively intensively police the vulnerable areas for where people are coming from? But we don't have to do it in a way that is overly aggressive, that arrests people and potentially loses the support of the local population through lack of consent to be policed, because policing has been heavy handed. So if you are then policing in a way that sort of says, hi, sir, are you aware that you're approaching a GMA? Would it be possible to take your details? Because then you can start figuring out, okay, is this guy a repeat offender? And this is all very theoretical. It might not work in practice, but you're taking those details. You then say, "Are you aware? You know, you're approaching a protected area. We have heard that there are elephants in the vicinity. So actually, here's the risk warning for human wildlife conflict, to give people a bit of a heads up if that is the case, because some of the concerns and the complaints that come out are that there's never law enforcement around to help prevent this human wildlife conflict. So you're getting the damage by the animals, and there's no law enforcement around to assist. So if you're proactively providing that service to at-risk areas, at the same time you're providing a presence, so that then the gentleman who was arrested wouldn't have been arrested, wouldn't have killed the diker, might have been able to assist in clearing up any snares that he may have laid, and is then able to go back to his home location and say, oh, rangers out there, difficult to move. And then the next person who comes out, if they find the same scenario, um, you're then getting this impression of the police are everywhere. It's not worth it. Let's go and do something else, because your risk perception, your cost benefit perception, and your calculation has changed, even though you haven't actually arrested anybody or arrested any more people. And so it's sort of bringing in that community policing, but it's not even community. Yeah, it's kind of community policing, but it's also targeted policing, but it's also community conservation because on the other side of it, if you know that you've got an area that is generating most of your offenders, maybe that's where you're putting in your livelihood scheme, alternative livelihoods, and those sorts of things to try and develop the whole thing as a system. Um, yeah, it's quite it's a bit nebulous. It's maybe not very well explained. Hopefully, it's not a silly idea. I sort of feel as though I keep reading about crime, thinking that's really interesting. What's happening in the conservation space on that thing, and then I haven't found answers, so I'm just sort of trying to figure out how do we get to the answers, how do we find out, and yeah, people may have already found out the answers and maybe doing it. I haven't been to all conservation spaces in the world, but from what I've seen so far, where I've been, I think there's a lot of opportunity to build on that and develop it.
What would it take in practice to properly test hotspot policing in a conservation setting? And what would you like to test first?
The main thing I want to test first is, can we apply hotspot policing theory in conservation? So at the moment, the literature is sort of saying that the most effective policing of hotspots is about 15 to 20 minutes, 2 to 3 times a day, for a certain period of time. And then you get a diffusion of benefits for a certain period of time before crime starts to ramp back up again. And we don't know if that would work in conservation. We don't know what the interval would be. So, would it be 2 times a day? Would it be 3 times a week? Would it be, what's the time period that you need to police the hotspot? Um, we don't know how long you would need to do that policing for you to get a reduction in crime, and you don't know how long that diffusion of benefits in time and space would last. So we don't have answers to any of those questions as far as I'm aware. So that's one thing. That's the first thing that I really want to do, as well as the risk terrain modelling. So I kind of want to do the two in concert, and that would probably cost. So I did have figures for how much it costs um, to send rangers out and how much it costs to support patrolling teams. And so what I think you would need to do is a randomized controlled trial where you have a space where you're patrolling as normal, and then you're doing your implementation in a different space, and you're seeing if you get different results. And so you would need to pay for that additional patrolling would be the key thing. But potentially also, um, it might be useful to have, what I'd initially wanted to do was actually put camera traps out, um, to review. So the original idea I had for my doctoral thesis was use the features of the environment to identify risk areas, and then put cameras on a risk area and a non-risk area, and then count the level of activity in each area to see if there was a significant difference between the two. So I tried that for my pilot project, but all of my assumptions were wrong. Um, and the cameras I had didn't work very well. And so I got about 1,000 images of leaves moving and ants walking along a branch. So I still think that might work. I now have a better idea of what are the features of the rural environment that somebody would need. So I would need to go and survey my risk areas to build up a risk map using the risk terrain modeling software, and then develop that policing program on the top of that to see if that would work. So it could be quite a long, involved project, and yeah, it would require camera traps and resources and food and ranger salaries and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I anticipate that one's going to be a fairly expensive one.
So, you have some courses on wild labs. How important do you think they are in helping people move from understanding the theory to actually applying them in the field?
Yeah, so with those courses, I'm really hopeful that more analysts are going to find them, and in fact, managers as well, because I think the managers need to have an understanding of crime science and the the so part of my doctoral output was a model or a framework that I've developed that kind of gives you a starting point on what information do you need and what are some other things that you need to be thinking about and those sorts of things to bring it all together, and really do that practical implementation, because that's another thing that I think is a little bit difficult for people, is that you get a lot of the theory, and people have these ideas. So you have things like competency standards for rangers, but sometimes people can struggle with, okay, how do we actually make that happen? Um, you might have a performance metric, but okay, what does that look like on the ground? And so the course deals with that a little bit as well. So I think it could be, I'm hopeful, really hopeful it will be useful for managers as well as analysts, to give them a little bit of a background in crime science, to have an idea, show them an idea of what they can do with their data. Um, I've seen a lot of analysts out there who are really imaginative, but don't necessarily have the tools or know what tools they need. So they don't know what they don't know, in terms of, oh, I can do this with QGIS, and then start putting those questions together. And they're really curious and bright. And when I've I've run about 6 of these cohorts already, and in talking to people, they're all sort of saying, "Oh yeah, that's really useful. I hadn't thought of it that way. Oh, actually, yeah, that would make my life a lot easier." Um, and so yeah, just to spark that idea and give people a few tools to be able to start thinking about it differently in terms of how do they implement. Um, because the lead ranger course was absolutely fantastic, and while I was with Panthera, they put a few people through that course as well, and then working with a group in a protected area, that some of them had done the lead ranger course, but they still didn't quite have the right, or not the right idea, but they still didn't really know where to start. So we were looking at logging, for example. And so we had some very disparate sort of bits of information that hadn't been consistently collected. And it was, oh, well, there was this seizure in March, and then there was that size there. And so you didn't have a kind of an overall picture of what the scale of the problem was. It was just something that, oh, well, this is a problem. You didn't have a starting point for a strategy of how do we measure it and how do we deal with it, because those two bits of information aren't really enough information to sort of come up with a plan. Um, and so what I did was take open source data using vegetation, terrain, so contours and slope and ruggedness, and roads, and I put those three things together to build a risk map that I could then put into a hexagonal form to say, okay, these areas have got a risk rating of this, and color code it so that you could see which of your hexagons were the highest risk rating. And then that would allow somebody to go, okay, well, we'll split our area into chunks, and then this group can take that area and you can confirm or refute. Has there already been logging in this area? Has there not been logging, but you've got the right kind of tree? So does it support the risk map? Is the risk map completely wrong? And then you've got that strategy that you can say to people, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, is we're first going to go and confirm that this map is right. That then gives us an idea of what the scale of the problem is, and then we can say, okay, well, this is where we need to start, and we can then come up with a problem solving that follows on from that. And so I think by giving people a sort of a data based starting point, it can make it easier for them to decide what they need to do to design an intervention. And I think sometimes that's that might be something that's lacking in terms of the theory to practice sort of. So when I was doing, I've cited this paper. It's called "Bridging the Knowledge Action Gap," which I quite like the phrase to that. So yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to do, is really bridge that knowledge action gap, so that we end up with action from the research.
Is the key really about using data in a way that helps you understand what's actually happening rather than just reporting the numbers.
Yeah, because I mean, the data is great, but a lot of it tends to end up as how many kilometers have we patrolled in a year? How many people have we arrested? Which don't really tell you anything about the crime level because, okay, fine, you've patrolled 211,000 kilometers in a year, but so what? What does that mean? How what coverage, how many people did you see, sort of where were the crime areas, so just stating that figure doesn't say anything really. And then saying, okay, well, we made 40 arrests. Okay, great, but what level of arrest was it? Was it an individual opportunistic one time, maybe goes once or twice a year, or was it a committed big party, who are doing this once a month, who are causing a lot more damage? And so that sort of just that figure of 40 arrests doesn't really tell you anything. And so what I'm trying to do is get at the point where we're actually targeting the things that really do tell you something.
When you disrupt a crime in a hotspot, what typically happens to the offenders? Do they stop or do they simply move elsewhere?
The idea is that you get displacement with attrition. So if you reduce crime in a certain area, that crime will be happening in that certain area because it's the right place for that crime to be happening. Um, so if you then disrupt that people's ability to commit crime in that area, some of them then move to a different area where the opportunities for crime are not as good, or crime would already have been happening there. Fewer people will do it. Some people will fall by the wayside and drop out. And so if you keep doing that, you get this sort of attrition until you get it down to a much smaller level of people who are persistent and continuing. And maybe those people need to go to jail. But but some of the others that fall by the wayside, if there are other better opportunities for them to fall into, maybe they don't need to go to jail. And that's maybe not the most effective thing that you could be doing for the community, for the environment, for conservation in general. Um, and so, yeah, again, it's a question. It's an idea. Is it going to work? Does it depend on the context? Sure. Um, it's all very untested, very theoretical, but hopefully something that can be tested at some point in the future, not too far in the future, I hope.
What made you decide to develop a formal training course to share these methods?
So I do a guided session. So it's I talk people through the problems and I show them how to do things on QGIS. Um, so I do that, and then I've also sort of developed it as PDF downloads, so somebody can go in and they can, if they know QGIS pretty well, they don't need, because I'm not a QGIS expert. I've All I'm doing is trying to save people the hours of sitting doing repetitive data analyses, and getting it wrong and making the mistakes that I've made. And so I'm trying to provide a workflow for some analyses that would get you a certain number of answers that could then help shape your strategy and sort of frame what aims you're going to decide on. So it's things like, how do you run a least cost pathway from where to where, and why would you be doing that? And it took me ages, and I was making silly mistakes like not having my starting point in the slope or in the raster layer that I was trying to use as my cost layer. Um, so I'm trying to save people some time from that respect, but sort of using the crime theory behind it. But then, yeah, I've also developed it as a kind of downloadable pack with some simulated data that I've created so that people don't have to use their own data or sensitive data. Um, and if every national park or every protected area in the English speaking world would just buy one copy, then I will be able to set up my own wildlife crime research institution, which actually would be a dream. But yeah, Hand back to reality.
Well, time for us to close up here. So thank you, Emma. This has been such a fascinating conversation. What really stands out to me is how you're bringing together crime science, data, and conservation in a way that's not just theoretical, but genuinely practical. It's about moving from simply reacting to wildlife crime to understanding it, anticipating it, and ultimately preventing it more effectively. This conversation also highlights how conservation isn't just about ecology, it's also about people, behavior, incentives, and systems. And by applying these structured, evidence based approaches, there's a real opportunity to make conservation efforts more efficient, more targeted, and ultimately more successful. So, thank you very much for sharing your experience and your insights and the work you're doing to help bridge that gap between theory and practice. Please check out the links in the description for Emma's courses, articles, and more. Thank you for listening.